Today I'm going to give you another update on some of the IgG4 related science. We're talking about the unusual IgG4 antibodies that we see in practically all of the mRNA vaccinated individuals. So if you've been following my videos, you know that I follow the science very religiously, if I can say it like that, and wanted to give you, since 2025 is coming to an end, I wanted to maybe catch up with some of the information that has been coming out in this year as well. So it's time to give you an update, and I'll tell you about the first two publications that came out at the start of this year, 2025, because it gives us more information and more clues. So the paper that I want to tell you is from France. It was published in April 2025, and it provides some new information we have not seen before, but it also confirms some information. So for example, it confirms that if you get infected prior to vaccination, infected by the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, prior to the vaccination, that protects you from development of these IgG4 antibodies. Okay, it's now the 7th paper by my count that is giving us that information. Now, it also tells us that if you get infected after you're vaccinated, that infection then acts like another booster that boosts the IgG4 antibody levels. All right, so this is also, I believe, 7th paper that might be showing this, but it is also the first paper to look at any individuals who were infected first, then took vaccinations, and then they were infected again. The infection post-vaccination is called breakthrough infection, and thanks to this work, it also hints some of the information that depending on how many encounters with the spike protein you have after you were vaccinated, even though you were infected before, the more spike protein encounters you might have, both via vaccination or infection, eventually that protection might be broken. And we had one paper before that suggesting this as well, so this would be now potentially a second one showing this. So that's important news as well. And they also looked at effector functions and how these IgG4 antibodies that are being produced in mRNA vaccinated people affect immune cell effector functions. I'll explain that in more detail for you as well. What is effector functions? This is a term to describe how immune system deals with the problem. So obviously we all know that antibodies come in and they start interacting, say, with the pathogen or a cell that has a spike protein on its surface. If the antibodies bind to either the pathogen or the cell that has pathogen proteins on its surface, the immune system is then supposed to obviously clear it, target it, and destroy it. And that's exactly what happens. And it does it via, the immune system does it via referred to effector functions. There's multiple types of these functions that can achieve this for us. One of them includes natural killer cells. They will recognize these antibodies binding to the cells with, say, spike protein on the surface, and they will kill those cells. That's what I mean by the effector function. So they are now the 8th paper, by my count, from the papers that I've studied so far that have investigated this. And the vast majority of these papers show that these effector functions are reduced while the IgG4 level antibodies increase in these individuals. And I will tell you and explain to you how this inadvertently or accidentally might enhance the possibility of infection in the mRNA vaccinated individuals, infection by the virus because of that. So we're going to talk about how vaccines might protect you from one thing and inadvertently cause issues somewhere else. And that issue could be increased risk of infections. And I'll show you some of the data from various sources that explain that, not just for mRNA vaccines, but other conditions as well, other viruses, including influenza. All right, my name is Dr. Mikhail of Genomics, and let's get started. So as I mentioned, this paper wanted to compare, they wanted to look at what hybrid immunity does. Now, what is hybrid immunity? That hybrid immunity, specifically in this paper, they were referring to people who were infected first. So they had the immunity from infection and then they were vaccinated. Hence the word hybrid, because they got immunity from infection as well as vaccines. And they wanted to compare the effect of hybrid immunity to those who had breakthrough infections, meaning those who were vaccinated and then got infected, and what would be the difference. And as a consequence, they studied 5 different groups of people in the study. They all were mRNA vaccinated via Pfizer or Moderna. They did not specify the differences. They just looked at those who were vaccinated with either one of those 2 shots. And each group of people had 15 individuals in it, and these were the groups. So there were people who just had 3 mRNA vaccine shots. That's one group, okay? And then they looked at those who had 3 mRNA shots, and then they had breakthrough infection. So they had infection afterwards. So that's another group. They compared that with those 3 different groups of people who were infected first. So they looked at people who were infected first, and then they had 2 mRNA shots, versus another group who were infected first and they had 3 mRNA shots. And then they looked at one more group who was infected first, had, I believe it was 2 mRNA shots, and then they were infected again. So this is the unique group. We've never seen any publication covering such information yet. So this will be the first of its kind that I'm aware of in terms of studying this. And they analyze them in many different ways. Let me show you what the effect of breakthrough infection was. So they compare, in the very first figure we're going to look at, is they're comparing those people who had 3 shots and then they had breakthrough infection, all right, they were affected afterwards, and this would be Omicron infection. We all know that once Omicron came around, everyone was getting infected left and right, and the vaccines were no longer protecting you from not being infected, right? So everyone was getting infected with Omicron. So they looked at that group versus the group who had infection, 2 mRNA shots, and another infection. So both of these 2 groups had 4 encounters with the spike protein, all right, whether it's through infection or vaccination. And by the way, if you're wondering, how can they know for sure whether that's exactly what happened and it wasn't asymptomatic infection? They were looking at healthcare practitioners, so people who were screened very regularly. They were screened throughout a period of time that was at least a year, maybe longer, and they were regularly screened like on a weekly basis. So that means any infection, whether it was symptomatic or asymptomatic, would have been detected, okay? So that's how we know exactly what the history is for these particular individuals. And the take-home message is that those who were infected first and then they had subsequent 3 encounters with the spike protein, including infection after vaccination, there's 2 things that stood out. Number one, their IgG4 level antibodies were lower. So this confirms that the infection prior to vaccination protects you from having this very high level of IgG4 antibodies. It lowers it in those individuals. And you can clearly see that depending on which variant they were looking at, it was about 1.5 times less IgG4 antibodies than the people who were never infected first, had 3 shots, and then they were infected. So that was one of the most curious effects they wanted to look at. And on top of that, they looked at the effector function. So remember how the immune system is supposed to clear either the pathogen or cells that were infected by the pathogen. So they would be showing spike protein on the surface. And this is the key, the effector functions. And they specifically look at antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, ADCC. And that's one of those effector functions. And this is where natural killer cells recognize the antibody that is binding to the spike protein either on the cell surface, and they will destroy it. So that's the specifically ADCC effector functions, the antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity. The name itself makes sense here, right? It tells you everything in the name. And that was massively lower in the people who were never infected first, had 3 shots, and then subsequent infection. That was massively lower depending which variant you looked at, that was between 4 to 5 times lower in such individuals than the ones who were infected first. So infection, meaning hybrid immunity, it protects you from not only from increasing those IgG4 antibodies, but it also protects you from reducing those effector functions. So that's the benefit of hybrid immunity. What is the benefit of vaccination itself without that hybrid immunity, without that infection first? Well, those individuals happen to produce antibodies that could target more variants more effectively, meaning they had more neutralizing power. Now, what is neutralization? This is the ability of these antibodies to prevent the virus from being able to get inside our cells. That's neutralization. So this is the trade-off that they were doing this. And what's really interesting is that they show this relationship that this effector functions that was reduced in vaccinated individuals. Because remember, they looked at a variety of groups. This was IgG correlated to the IgG4 levels, so that the more IgG4 antibody levels were seen in vaccinated individuals, the less of these effector functions, that antibody dependence, cellular cytotoxicity was observed in these individuals. All right. And this is important. And I'll explain that in a moment, why that might be important. So that's another thing they looked at. And one more graph that I'll show you from that paper. I'll show you why I stated that there is a hint that even though you're infected first, and this data has been clearly demonstrated over and over, that the infection protects you over time from producing those IgG4 antibodies, that protection might disappear if you keep having encounters with the spike protein. So they showed all 5 groups in some of the graphs. So let me show you this, and we're going to focus one group at a time. So I'm going to show you the results for a group that had the least number of IgG4 antibodies. And that was the group that was infected first, and then they had 2 mRNA shots only. That's it. So 3 encounters with spike protein. 1 via infection, which was the first one, and then 2 mRNA shots afterwards, okay? And they had the lowest amount of IgG4 antibodies. Now, the next one afterwards is a group of people who were infected first, but they had now 3 mRNA shots afterwards. And you can see their IgG4 antibodies increased a little bit afterwards, right? It's not statistically significant, so we would say there is no difference because of the lack of the statistical significance. But there were also another paper that suggested that this effect might be broken over time in terms of that protection from IgG4 antibody rising because of infection. And this is another hint. It's not statistically significant, but it's a hint. So it shows you that when you went from 3 encounters with the spike protein to 4 encounters, there was that slight increase in IgG4 antibodies. And that slight increase in IgG4 antibodies was very similar to the same levels as those of as people who were infected first had 2 mRNA shots afterwards, and then they were infected again. So that's also 4 encounters, very similar. And it's also very similar to people who only had 3 shots of mRNA, and that's it. And we all know that 3 shots of mRNA, those who had 3 or more shots of mRNA were definitely producing IgG4 antibodies if they were never infected first. So you see that comparison. But the group that had the highest level of IgG4 antibodies was the group that had 3 shots of mRNA, and then they had a breakthrough infection. So infection afterwards. So that's again 4 encounters, but because they never were infected first prior to shots, you can see there was no protection, and their IgG4 antibodies are the highest. So that's the information on the IgG4 levels. Okay. Now the authors comment look, the benefit of vaccination without infection first, so not having hybrid immunity, the benefit here is the fact that you have higher antibodies post-vaccination, and not only higher amounts, so you have higher levels of antibodies. They have ability to interact with more sites of the viral proteins than so, so they have higher ability to interact more viral protein contact points. All right, so there's also that. So that's another benefit, and therefore they neutralize the virus better than those who have hybrid immunity. Great. That means, what does that mean? As I mentioned, it means it is more effective in preventing the virus of entering inside our cells, which is how the virus will replicate. So that's the benefit here, all right? But it comes at a price, and the price here is that they have lower effector functions, right? They don't get to clear the virus as well as those who have hybrid immunity. That's number one. And then hybrid immunity also reduces those IgG4 antibodies. And IgG4 antibodies mask the spike protein from detection from our immune system, which might explain also why you see that reduced amount of our immune system ability to clear the virus. So while the vaccination gives you the ability to prevent the virus from infecting our cells, it reduces the capacity of clearing the virus from our system. And the authors mentioned this might be not insignificant issue. And the reason why is because it's fairly well established that intact effector functions are very important for actually clearing the disease, getting rid of the pathogen from the system. And there is documented evidence showing this from numerous studies. And I'll come back to this right away, but then I'm going to also show you right now an abstract from a conference which was published, I believe this was January 2025, by a group that I believe included both American and Australian scientists. And we've already seen some of their work before when they investigated the effect of Novavax vaccine as a booster to either prior Novavax vaccination or mRNA vaccination. So I covered that in a video before as well. Another ferret behind, wow, busy traffic lane. And they published recently this abstract that clearly also demonstrated that IgG4 interferes with these effector functions. So they show this image in that abstract for the conference that there is a great correlation between IgG1 antibodies and neutralization, meaning you prevent the virus from infecting the cells. And IgG1s are the best antibodies for neutralization. So you can clearly see the more IgG1 antibodies you have, the more neutralization you have. IgG3 still showed that effect, but it wasn't as effective. And then IgG4 on the right-hand side, you see not only it doesn't have that effect, it's actually negative effects, meaning the more IgG4 antibodies you had, it started to interfere with proper neutralization of the virus, which is not what you typically expect because they're not supposed to play much of a role in neutralization. Nevertheless, they show that, but they also showed this table that showed that IgG4 levels interfered with all of the effector functions possible. So they interfere with this antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, ADCC. So that's where the natural killer cells are supposed to recognize the antibody and go kill the infected cell. So that was negatively correlated, meaning that the more IgG4 antibodies you had, the less you saw those effector functions. But they also looked at some other ones. They also looked at antibody-dependent cellular phagocytosis. So that means other type of immune cells, such as macrophages or dendritic cells, they recognize the antibody that is targeting the pathogen or cell, and they engulf it and then destroy it that way too. So that's that's also negatively correlated, meaning the more IgG4 antibodies, the less you had that protective effector function mechanism. And the last one was antibody-dependent complement deposition. Now, what is that? Complement is think of it like a series of proteins that are in your blood that if they recognize a certain antibodies, they can start attaching to it and they will mark it for the immune system for further destruction. So that's part of complement. And that was also negatively correlated with IgG4 levels. So very important data that is still awaiting publication because, as I mentioned, this is actual conference abstract. So that's the first two papers from the IgG4s that for this year that I want to mention. But now I'm going to come back to how the authors of the French study mentioned that when you reduce effector functions, you might start interfering with proper clearance of the virus from your system. And they gave an example, historical example of respiratory syncytial virus. And it's been known that those individuals who had higher levels of higher levels of IgG4 in their system, they also had reduced levels of those effector functions and therefore more likelihood increased infection with that virus afterwards. And the reason why this is interesting, because we have seen some data showing that for the mRNA vaccines as well. There was a very famous or infamous study, depending on your point of view, that came out, I believe it was maybe 2023, that showed that based on 50,000 individuals in, I believe it was a Cleveland clinic, there were healthcare professionals that were studied, and they wanted to see the effect of the latest bivalent vaccine on the well-being of these individuals. And the vaccine was temporarily protecting these people from infection. But what they also observed is that the more mRNA shots individuals had over time throughout the study period, and they studied them for 26 weeks, I believe, the more likely they were going to be infected. And there was this famous graph showing this. Now, the authors at the time attributed to maybe like spurious effects, and they were saying like, oh, maybe vaccinated people are more likely to test themselves. Well, they just released a preprint, meaning this is not published yet, showing something very similar for influenza virus. And they were showing that for influenza, in that same group of people in a hospital, more than 80% of people were taking vaccines against influenza, and for the last 2024-25 season did not seem to be protecting these people from influenza infection. And as a matter of fact, during the highest peak of influenza infection rate, that the vaccinated individuals were more likely to be infected by influenza than the non-vaccinated individuals. And they were mentioning this has been seen before in some other data, and it reflected that the more influenza vaccinations people had in more recent time, the more likely they were to be infected by influenza. So it's not that influenza vaccine might not protect you from influenza and cause a problem. It's how many influenza vaccines you might have taken in a short time period that might be the risk here. So they commented on that, and what's interesting is that, of course, they were now curious, well, could this be the effect of vaccinated people being more health conscious and therefore they're testing themselves more often? But what they looked at is that those who were, whether you were vaccinated or not vaccinated, if you tested yourself, the likelihood of being infected was the same between those two groups. So it shows you that simply vaccinated individuals were simply, so the test results were the same between same likelihood of positive result if you were vaccinated versus not to have positive results. So this does not show you that this was related to simply vaccinated people having more tests. It showed that vaccinated people were more likely to be infected, and they show that in that graph. Now, keep in mind, this is preprint. We have not yet, so it's not yet fully confirmed whether this is accurate or not. All right, so then this shows you that there's this underappreciated concept that perhaps having too many vaccines in too short period of time could negatively influence the ability for the person to be infected because of this temporary effect on suppressing those effector functions of your immune system. We clearly have seen this yet, and the authors comment on this. Maybe we should be paying attention to this. as a potential problem when we're considering vaccination. So how frequent you vaccinate might be an issue. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. It's a long video. There's no way around it. But before I go, please comment what you think about this concept. Please share the video. This is how we grow. And also one more thing, please check out my Patreon account for a couple of reasons. I am now working on a project where, with your help, the community, if you can be free patron, but as well, and contribute information into what it means, what is the best way to practice healthy living. I really want to get to the bottom of this. This is going to be an ongoing project for me. So that's number one. And reason number two is that if you're supporting Patreon, meaning you're putting money down on the table, then you also get to vote to determine as to what content eventually comes out on the YouTube channel itself. All right. So that's all I have for today. I know it's complicated, and I'll see you guys in the next installment on more IgG4 related videos, because there's clearly more papers came out. Very interesting stuff. So there's more stuff we're going to be talking about. Nothing is simple when it comes to immunology and immune systems, and whether you were vaccinated or not vaccinated, you seem to have benefits one way or another. And it just depends on what it is. It's like a trade-off. All right. Bye, everyone.